is quantum that special? I was reading Holton, and I found this really interesting quote about special relativity. And so I'm wondering, this buzzword that is quantum mechanics that everyone seems to be talking about right now. Is it that special? Let's find out. So in a very broad brushstrokes kind of way, I'm going to attack two very complicated things. Five, really. But in philosophy, there's two sort of dominant or main forms of philosophy that occur. One's called Continental Philosophy, and one's called Analytic Philosophy. And each of them has an infinite number of possible interesting things about it, and it's not really a binary anymore in the way that it once was, but for the purposes of this video, we can use them as a sort of analogy to something that's going on in science. We don't have time here to rigorously define either of those things, but we're going to go with a really basic dichotomy that is analytic philosophy is often about appreciating the value of objective truth, the truth that's out there in the world, and then continental philosophy is about appreciating the value of truth internally. What's the subjective view? How can you understand the world from your own personal perspective? And this distinction is useful for lots of things, but we're just going to use it right now to sort of refer to objective truth and subjective truth. These are two different ways of going about philosophy, and what's interesting about them for right now is that the objective truth way takes as an assumption that human beings sort of can get at what objective truth is. We can learn it to some degree, and the subjective truth way sometimes says, yeah, maybe, but maybe one, there isn't even an objective truth at all, which could be the case, and then two, even if there is such a thing as objective truth, we don't necessarily have the ability to access it from our individual historical perspectives. So how this relates to quantum mechanics is because lots of people throw quantum mechanics around on the internet like it is a just flag to wave for the validity of subjective truth or the validity of what people are throwing around lots of nonsense on the internet about quantum. So be careful when you're listening to someone talk about quantum. But without getting into too many of the details, it seems like we, in learning about quantum mechanics, actually have kind of points one for the subjectivist camp. Because if you listen to sort of popular rhetoric around what quantum mechanics is about, you're going to hear a lot of the observer collapses the wave function, or the observer this, or the subject that, and it's our measurement that matters. The point is that you hear a lot of people talking about how subjectivity is weaseling its way back into physics through quantum mechanics. Now, before going any further, let's back up in a second. This is not... We don't agree on that. That's not settled. And in fact, there are lots of people who say that's absolutely the wrong way to go about thinking about quantum mechanics. So that's not necessarily agreed on or true. And you should be very careful when you hear people talking about observers collapsing the wave function, because that's not the predominant model right now. But actually, this video is not about that. It's about that phenomenon, that historical phenomenon, as it compares to other areas of physics, and we're just gonna get the quote. Okay, so this is Holton talking about Einstein and the theory of special relativity. What Einstein did in 1905 with his brash sentence declaring the ether to be superfluous as a result of elevating the principle of relativity from a heuristic conjecture to a fundamental proposition, was to pull up the curtain and to announce that there was nothing at all behind it. The demand that absolutes in science should be considered to be meaningless, that the ether, the last refuge of inscrutable reality to be abandoned, was too overwhelming for most scientists to hear. And then he goes on to read a quote from Sir Oliver Lodge in the 20s. And in the 20s, he's saying, only phenomena can be observed or verified. Absolute fact is inaccessible. So I bring this up because the concept that absolute fact is inaccessible as a consequence of special relativity is why Oliver Lodge was critiquing relativity. He's saying, you can't actually believe in relativity because it throws under the bus the concept of absolute reality. And that's why I'm making this video, because that's the argument that we're having about quantum mechanics right now. People are saying, well, that can't be the case. Like, you can't have subjective observers happening in quantum theory because of that subjectivity doesn't belong in physics. And these people are saying, oh, you can't have objectivity ruined. You can't take the ether. We don't know what ether. Okay, back in the day, ether was every wave has a medium of propagation. I can move the camera sort of by moving the desk. I can move sound through air. Every wave moves through a medium, and ether was the medium of the motion of light back in the day. And this was how we were able to know our absolute position in space. Space was believed to be absolute. Motion was not relative. Motion was relative to some absolute sort of center of the universe. And in this ethereal world where ether was the objective sort of stuff of the universe, then we could see objectivity happening in the universe. Because the experiments are really fun. You can look up the Michelson-Morley experiment, which was to test whether or not the ether existed. And incidentally, Einstein and Michelson and Morley, though it's unclear like who exactly discovered it first. I mean, they happened at the same time, and sources Einstein's ambiguous as to whether or not he knew about those experiments. But anyway, at the same time, special relativity theory and the experiments in the Michelson-Morley experiment are disproving the existence of the ether, the objective thing in space that sort of grounds our position disappears. And again, the purpose of this video is not to like go through all the details of quantum or of special relativity. There are other videos that are good for that, but the abstraction that we can take away from this is that at the time people rejected special relativity because it detracted from the objectivity. It detracted from our ability to know the objective world. Only phenomenon could be verified. Absolute facts are inaccessible, which should be abhorrent to science, because science is about objective facts. Okay. So what's the point? Why am I talking about this? Why am I making this video? The connection here that's interesting is that in our particular moment in history, we are seeing the destruction of causality that comes from quantum mechanics, and we're inserting the role of the observer, and we're saying, oh, objectivity is lost, yay for subjective perspective collapsing the wave functions or whatever. None of that might be true, but that's the argument that some people are saying. That's one of the problems with quantum theory, is it tears away at the objectivity that we're searching for in science. And then in special relativity, we're doing the same thing 90 years ago. And then I even still wanted to make this video because you can think even further back. This happened with Darwin as well. When we were talking about Darwinian evolution, there was this fear that like Darwin was taking away from the objectivity of God's plan in some way, that like human beings are distinct from mammals, and now we're not. We're now related to them. Now there's this just gradient of evolution instead. That can't be. And then you can go even further back, and the same discussion was happening when we were talking about whether or not the Earth was the center of the universe. If the Earth was at the center of the universe, we were the objective core of the universe, and everything else was sort of relative to us. But each of these scientific advances is chipping away at that objectivity, instead of having this just core, like, I keep using this word a lot, and then I'll address it, like this core objective understanding of the world. Every scientific advance that we seem to be making seems to be chipping away at those things that we held sacred, those things that we held to be objective. So now at long last we can come back to those terms that we introduced at the beginning, the analytic philosophy and the continental philosophy. Is it the case that we can take special relativity, for example, as evidence for a perspectival, subjective, like limited perspective on the universe? Time is not objective. Space is not objective. Linear, the order of events is not objective for certain frames of reference. Like, can't we take all of this to mean that everything is relative? And isn't that points for continental philosophy? Okay, but I'm not I'm not so happy with this word objective and subjective. I don't know that it helps us that much. So let's talk instead for just a minute about the components of the universe, the fundamental constituents of the universe. Every discovery that we seem to be making seems to be pulling us further and further away. Space and time, those aren't objective. Matter itself, position itself, momentum itself, those aren't objective. So it seems like the more time passes, the more, even though we appear to be moving closer towards the fundamental constituents of reality, we're actually seeing that we might be further and further barred from them than we think. And if special relativity and quantum are to be trusted or interpreted liberally, we actually subjectively have much more of a role and perspective in that than we might think. And that, I think, is interesting and like was worth making this video. Cool. Okay, so thank you for watching. We are, I'm going to just take this video that we just made and then make a video that's just exactly the opposite of what I just said, which I think is good for thinking. So check out that one about why everything that I just said is completely wrong. Cool.